Hey there, folks, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Josh, and I'm an event planner here with the Orange County Library System. Tonight we have our presenter tonight is Christopher Balzano, and he'll be presenting the event Chilling Campfire Tales. Christopher is a legend tripper, a teacher, a storyteller, and an author, and just a really fantastic person to speak to about any of your local ghost stories or national ghost stories. He is a pro in all of them and has really great firsthand experience going to those places and speaking on them. But before we get started, I wanted to go through a couple of things. First of all, this program was brought to you by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. They provided the cameras and other equipment that we were using tonight, so thank you very much for that grant. If you have any questions throughout the event, please feel free to just add those into the comments. I'll be reading through those the whole time, and if they are relevant to a specific story, I can just jump in and see if Christopher can answer them. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Christopher Balzano. Christopher, how are you doing today?
Excellent. How are you guys doing tonight?
I'm doing fantastic, and I hope everyone out there is doing fantastic as well. Yeah, let us know you're watching. Thank you so much for presenting tonight. What are we going to hear about?
Tonight's Chilling Campfire Tales, I'm entitling Whistling Past Florida Cemeteries. Ooh. So if there's anyone out there who is familiar with the term whistling past the graveyard, they will know this is kind of a little play on that. The term whistling past a graveyard means to pretend that something is not wrong, even though you know it is, right? It dates back to the idea that you would whistle through a graveyard to keep the spirits from kind of, coming up on you or attacking you or anything like that. And then when you were out, you would stop whistling, but it became known as this kind of way to keep spirits away, keep you calm, even though you were really scared. And this is a little bit of a play on that. So I should probably take it back a little bit of a step. I'm a big fan of the Stanley idea that every presentation, even though I've done, I think, 87 for you guys now, presentation is someone's first presentation. So I should start out by saying a little bit about myself. And as you can see in this picture, I am wearing the Camp Crystal Lake shirt that we talked about. I'm wearing one tonight as well. My name is Christopher Balzano. I'm originally from Massachusetts. I just passed my 13-year mark, my 13-year anniversary being here in Florida. And I spent, since 1994, being involved in the paranormal. I originally started as a storyteller and as a person who began writing about weird stories that people were telling me. I moved into becoming an investigator for a lot of years, for about 2 decades of that. And then I started to want to focus more on what I call the heart of the story, right? Everyone gets into this because they hear a ghost story that freaks them out. They don't get into it because they're looking for evidence. So I'm pushed off the paranormal investigator, and I now do what Josh said is legend tripping, which means I go to different places and I research the stories that people say about it, right? What kind of stories are being told about a specific location? And then, of course, what does that how can history back it up? Can I back up what people are saying there? But then also, what does telling those stories mean about the community, right? A ghost story can be very different from community to community. So many of them have the same themes or they involve the same things, but they're a reflection of the people who are telling them. So that's kind of what legend tripping is. And then, of course, I go out and I try to experience it. And rather than trying to capture it, like a lot of people do, what I try to do is just sit back and experience it. The only recording we ever do is video, pictures, and audio, but that's mainly to kind of capture what we have. And oddly enough, in doing that, I've caught some of the best evidence of ghosts, even more than I was an investigator.
That's awesome. Thanks again for coming out. I'll leave it to you. But I love your stories are fantastic. So I'm really excited to get into these again.
Thank you. As I said, I'm also an author. So I've written a whole bunch of books. I'm one of the leading authorities on a place called the Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts. But also I have a new book out, my first book officially about Florida, which is called Haunted Florida Love Stories. And it's all of these stories that have to do, they're ghost stories or ghostly legends that people tell all throughout Florida that have something to do with love. They're connected to love in somehow. And if you can go in, you can actually go into the YouTube of Orange County Libraries and find a presentation I did focusing on some of these. So I'm really excited. I'm just finishing up my newest book, which is about the Ocala National Forest. And in doing that, I was confronted with a whole bunch of different stories. And it became really overwhelming. And I started to look, sometimes I needed a distraction from that. I needed what you might call cute little ghost stories, especially when you're dealing with some places as dark as the Ocala. And I was thinking specifically about some place I had been in Indiana, the scariest place I'd ever been. It was called 100 Step Cemetery. And in this cemetery, you have to, exactly at midnight, climb these 100 steps. When you get to the top, if you've counted 100 steps on the way up, someone will appear and they will tell you the nature in which you're going to die. Then, once that person has told you that, you have to immediately go back down the stairs, once again counting the steps as you go. And if you don't count exactly 100, the bottom of the cemetery where the stairs end is supposed to open up and suck you into hell. And I thought just how ridiculous that was. But because of where it happened to be in Indiana, which in a lot of ways is the birthplace of the term urban legend, there was a ton of documentation of people who had either done this or knew someone who had done this or had heard the stories of it. And it started to click into my brain this idea and this relationship that we have with cemeteries. Every cemetery is haunted, right? There are ghosts in every cemetery, even though it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Why would the dead be in the place where their body, which they have no connection to anymore, is, right? Even if you talk about most cultures, even ones that believe we split, they all say the spirit might be where they died, the spirit might follow the relatives. Why are we consumed with this idea that every cemetery is haunted, right? And it, of course, comes from our own feelings that we need to feel as if we find peace ourselves, right? If our grandfather who's buried finds peace, we find peace, right? There's that idea that in the future, we'll be able to find a quiet place where everything is washed away, right? And we treat these with respect. We venerate them, and yet they're also really scary places because of that. Almost every culture that I've researched, and I've researched a lot, have some idea about things that are attacking our dead, right? So I'm not sure. I'm sure all of you guys recognize at least the character who's on the right here. This is, of course, Dracula, right? One of the vampires, one of the most famous vampires, and played by a person who I'm actually named after, Christopher Lee. I could never understand, other than the vampires rising up, why cemeteries were the location where vampires would go, right? It made sense to me why would they want to be near death afterwards? And yet, it's a very real thing. Another idea is this guy in the middle. This is a ghoul. So ghouls were originally written about or we got them as Europeans in 101 Nights or 101 Arabian Nights, depending on the translation. And they are an Arabic or a Middle Eastern concept, kind of like the negative side of the genie or the jinn. And what they would do is they would go into cemeteries, and as the dead would kind of rise from the graves, any spirit which was lost, any spirit which couldn't find the light, as we might say in modern times or in Western culture, they would eat them. They fed on their souls. And that also gave rise to, in so many cultures, the idea of a wizard. This is my picture of a wizard. Wizards, necromancers, people who would go into the cemeteries and they would either you try to raise the dead like a necromancer might, or Satanists and people who use witchcraft, which of course to many people is the same thing. And these people would go and try to take body parts or earth or clothing or something from the dead and use them in some kind of weird ritual that would eventually lead to the average person being attacked. So they need to be protected from that. And this little guy on the left, I just found out about recently. This is a Dawanga. And Dawangas are kind of the same idea as a ghoul, only they're an Appalachian idea of people who are lost near a cemetery, and of course the dead in the same way, can be eaten by this. So there are a ton of things that we need to do to protect the living and the dead in cemeteries. And yet, one of the primary urban legends, or one of the primary legend trips that we do as a community, especially as kids, are ones that involve cemetery rituals, right? You need to go into the cemetery and do some kind of special ceremony, and then a ghost will appear. Or one of the greatest ones I can think of outside of Florida is Madame Louise, the voodoo priestess of New Orleans. And people go who want to have more power. They go to her cemetery, they go to her mausoleum, and they write X's and they perform rituals in front of her mausoleum in hopes that it'll give them extra power, right? So this idea that somehow we need to trigger activity, we need to do some kind of ritual, and then the ghosts in cemeteries are going to start to talk to us. And so I started realizing that I had actually done a whole bunch of these kinds of stories in Florida without even realizing that connection, without even seeing this pull and this need that we have. It's not just kids who are going and challenging each other. I bet you can't spend all night on Mr. Johnson's grave, who's buried, and they said he's going to rise. This is actually, some people are doing it culturally. Some people are doing it, like we've discussed, in terms of a ritual to gain some kind of power. But these are things that are happening throughout Florida. And the first one I want to talk about is the tragedy of the Richardsons. So this is one of those stories where even if the history of it is one of the darker aspects of Florida, the idea of what this ritual is actually enlightening and actually, literally playful. So Oak Ridge Cemetery in Arcadia, Florida, is one of the most active cemeteries that I've ever been to, but also that's told about, right? It's one of those cemeteries where everyone seems to have an experience when they go there, whether it's a small little whisper that they hear in their ear, and there's a major Talking Mary statue that's in this, or whether they hear strange noises, or as some people do, this is actually the burial site of all of the RAF, that's the Royal Air Force pilots who died in training while they were over here in Florida training. They're all buried in this cemetery. And people have heard airplane battles happening above them, or the airplane crashes happening above them. They have one of the oddest ones, there's a Union Jack that flies in that part of the cemetery, and the Union Jack disappears. So on a day you'll be walking, the Union Jack will be flying, you'll walk a little bit more, and all of a sudden it'll be gone. And then a few minutes later, you look back towards that part of the cemetery, and the Union Jack is flying again. And these, while creepy and freaky in their own right, and I do a whole breakdown of Oak Ridge Cemetery in a previous presentation I did for you guys. The darker story is a story of the Richardsons and the murder of the children. So in 1967, a few days before Halloween of 1967, all of the 7 Richardson children all got sick, right? 6 of them died that day. 1 of them died the next day. And it was determined by the police that they had died of poisoning. So little Betty, Alice, Susie, Doreen, Vanessa, James Jr. all died, and then the next day Diane died. And they thought it was obvious who the killer was, and that was their father, James Richardson. No one in the community believed this whatsoever. James Richardson was a great father for all intents and purposes. He had already at work started putting money aside so that he could, by Christmas time, so this is Halloween, by Christmas time, afford bikes for his kids. He was known to do his kids' hair. He was known to sneak candy to them, which made him horrible in the eyes of his wife, but not in the eyes of the community. This is a man who was eventually wrongly convicted and sentenced to life in jail for the murder of his children. Even though their babysitter, who had had them most of the day, a woman by the name of Bessie Reese, who was actually on parole for having killed her husband, or thought to have killed her husband with poison, even though she admitted to the crime, no one believed it because they were crazy. So he was essentially railroaded. The good news is, in 1989, after 30 years in jail, James Richardson was actually exonerated and released from jail. If you go to the cemetery, and you can see it kind of down here, all of his children are buried in the same area. One of the most frequent things reported in Oak Ridge Cemetery are these little balls of light. We can call them orbs, we can call them will-o'-the-wisp, but these little balls of light that you can see with the human eye. If you're in this presentation, chances are you've seen ghost pictures, these little balls of light that are probably dust or bugs. No, these are anywhere between a softball and a basketball, different colored. They're blue, they're yellow, they're green, they're white, and they seem to come up directly out of the ground and then dance with each other. They seem to be playing. Most people, when they see them, say they see at least 3 at the same time. So if you know the great explanations for, oh, well, that's the gases in the cemetery, or it's swamp gases if you see it someplace else, these are 3 happening at the exact same time, constantly, and then interacting with each other, playing with each other, rolling around with each other. The best legend that's about these children is, if you want, you can play with the Richardson kids. If you go to this cemetery and you lay down toys, and you can see in some of these shots here, my children and I actually went to this cemetery. You can see, especially here, we've laid down toys on these graves. And then what you need to do is you need to go and hide or crouch behind one of these headstones. If you do this, one or more of the Richardson kids is said to play a game of hide and seek with you. So you'll hear giggling, and that's how you know the game has started. And then you run around the cemetery hiding behind headstones, and behind you, you'll hear giggling, you'll hear footsteps running across the dirt, running across the grass. You can even catch a glimpse of them scooting behind a headstone and crouching down. And people have actually gone there and been able to play entire games with these children who are trapped in the cemetery, but have at least found each other. Their spirits are said to be in several other locations that are related to this as well, and it's the same kind of activity. You can go, and if you go there, one of the ones that's nearby, it's said that you have to actually count to 10, and if you count to 10, all of a sudden these balls of light will start appearing and almost chasing you around. I'm not sure if I would at night go in this cemetery and play, but we definitely have been there during the day, and although they've never played with us, we have had things like the toys that we have displayed or we've left for them be moved. Not too far away from there, we have, it's still in Arcadia, this formerly forgotten cemetery, the Coker Family Cemetery, and the Cursed Children of Coker. So if you look at this picture, it would seem to be, you might even say, a typical Florida cemetery. In that, it's not this huge, gigantic, sprawling place, of which there are some in Florida, but rather a family plot which has been fenced off. Well, only recently has this been fenced off. This is literally in the middle of orchards. of orange groves, I should say. So all around here, you cannot see this cemetery if you're from the road. It took me 3 times going out to find this cemetery before I was able to actually locate exactly where it was. You can't see it from the road. You can't even really see it till you're right up on it. The Coker family was a very prominent family in Arcadia, and they allowed other people who couldn't necessarily afford it to be buried with them. One of the families that are buried there are the Lott family. So most of the people that are in here are related to each other. And you can go down and you can actually look at history books and see, oh, this person married this person. That's why that family's there. And then there are the Lott children who were buried there. And their names are Nellie, Frida, and Mary Lucille. And they're buried kind of in between other members of the Coker family, but the Lotts have no connection to them whatsoever. So it's not as if they're in a corner where other people might be who couldn't afford. No, these are featured predominantly with the family graves, but the Lott family is not connected to the Cokers in any way. This has allowed people to think about, well, why are they buried there? What's up with them? Why would they be with this family they had no connection to, as opposed to just kind of buried off to the side? And it all has to do with a legend that's being spread throughout Arcadia. And that is that the Lott family was expecting their first child. And right around the time that she was entering her last trimester, a man pulled up in a truck, and this man is described as either being a gypsy, or someone said, some of the other stories say he's of Jewish descent. Whatever you might be, whatever the story might actually be, what you need to read is he was an outsider to that community. He pulls up and he volunteers to do some work that the Lotts need on their farm in exchange for an agreed upon amount of money. They agree. The man works there for about a week. He finishes the work. The week ends up. He goes to collect the money, and the Lotts refuse to pay him. And of course, this causes a big. He gets disrupted, and disruptive, and he's threatening to fight. And they pull out a gun and they say, "Leave right now, or we'll shoot you." So he hops back into his truck. And right before he leaves, he pulls out and he looks at the pregnant Mrs. Lott and he says, "Your baby will not live to see their first birthday, and you will be cursed to never have a child." And he drives off. A few months later, Mary Lucille is born in 1916. And unfortunately, she dies right before her first birthday. So this is kind of the history part, right? There is Mary Lucille. She was born in 1916. She died in 1917. A few years go by, and Nellie Ray is born in 1920, and she dies before her first birthday. And then lastly, Frida May is born in 1924, and she lasts 17 months, just past her first birthday, and then she dies. Now, this is where the Lotts disappear from the history of Arcadia altogether. It said they realized they would never have children in this area. They packed up everything, and they left completely. The cemetery took pity on these kids because they had no other family. They brought them over to the Coker Cemetery, and they allowed them to go there. Same kind of thing happens here that happens in Arcadia. You can go and you can play with the Lotts. One of the things that they really like is if you read to them. So it's said that if you read to them, you will start to see these shadow figures, these small shadow figures out of the corner of your eye that kind of run to the grave. Now, the interesting thing is all of these graves that you see around them, actually it's over here in this picture, are all children. So there's the Lott family, and then there's other children. It's pretty much like a preschool in there to some degree. And they're all born, or they're all died fairly quickly. They were all young. But there's another ritual that you're supposed to do with the Cokers. And no one is able to say quite why this is so, but it's a very popular thing to do. If you go to Coker's Cemetery, you go to the Lot family, and you, with your eyes closed, leave coins on each of the children's headstones. Now, once you leave those coins on the headstones, it's said that you will have good luck. But before you can have that good luck, you have to perform one more little ritual. You put the coin on the headstone, and you put it heads up, has to be heads up. You walk around the rest of the cemetery, and if you come back, whatever your wish is, whatever the thing that you want, is going to come to you immediately if the coin is no longer there. And people have said they've put their coin down, they've walked the cemetery, they've come back, and it's been gone. Others say, or if that doesn't happen, it'll be heads up when you come back. And that means that you'll get what you want, but it's going to take a little bit of time. And then lastly, if you go back and you've put the coin down and it hasn't changed at all, sorry, you're on your own. You're not going to be granted the wish, and you're not going to get the luck that you want. And this is something that people firmly believe. And people have said as they've been walking along that cemetery, they've actually heard little children giggling. Now, I know what you're saying. 1-year-olds don't giggle. But it seems to be, whether it's the Cokers themselves or the ghosts of the other children that are in that cemetery, they're in some kind of playful mood and in some way, for some reason, able to kind of grant you what you want. The next story is one that you might actually know. It's one of the most famous ghost stories of Florida. So if you look in, weird Florida or most haunted places in Florida, one of the things that constantly comes up is Elizabeth Budd Graham's grave in Tallahassee. This is a very similar story, or kind of similar, at least in what you're supposed to ritually do, as the Cokers, or as the Lot family. This is known as Bessie's grave. And Bessie is Florida's favorite witch. I think we actually did a whole presentation on ghostly witches throughout Florida. And I didn't bring up Bessie because at that point I hadn't been to see her yet. Well, I've been to see her since then. And I can honestly say that this is a story that captivates the area. Every paranormal investigator I talk to has been there. Every folklorist wants to talk about it. But it is really a tragic story. So in Old City Cemetery, which was originally founded in 1829, you find the grave and the memorial, really, to Elizabeth Budd Graham, who's also known as Bessie. Now, Bessie died. She was born in 1866 and died in 1889. She was actually only 23 when she passed away. Her husband was considerably older than she was. And there are some weird elements to the memorial that's dedicated to her. So if you can look at this is all for Bessie. Not this the one above it, but the entire wall, the entrance into it, the obelisk that's there, the offering it's the finest stones that would have been found. This would have been in 1889 the most expensive grave in the cemetery, and yet her husband was not, one of the founding members of Tallahassee, or he wasn't, overly important. He did have money, but it's unusual, right? And because it's so ornate, because it's so it stands out in the rest of the cemetery, people wondered what was going on. Now, of course, and you can tell from something else I'm going to say, the man just really loved this woman, right? I mean, it was absolutely, from his mind, true love. And this was and he was so grieved. She had a young child when she died, that this was the only way that he could get over his grief. But there are a few elements of her story which lead people to believe that Bessie is actually a witch. The first part of it is that, it's ridiculously and disproportionately expensive and beautiful and bombastic. So the story goes that Elizabeth, or Bessie, actually was a witch. And she, using a love potion, made her husband absolutely fall in love with her, become obsessed with her, even after death. And that is used as evidence that she actually practiced witchcraft. The other thing is her grave is facing west, right? So traditionally people, when they're buried, are facing east. And that is so that they can see the rising sun, right? A few times I've seen graves that are pointing west. And sometimes in particular, some of the ones I've found, if you are a priest or if you are a pastor, there's a greater chance that your grave is going to be facing the west because you're facing your congregation. I actually discovered that when we were looking at another haunted cemetery in Brooksville. But hers is facing west. And people couldn't understand why that was. Now, a little bit of the spoilers. There are a few other graves that are in this cemetery that do face west. And there really is no explanation why Bessie or anyone else is kind of facing the wrong way, you might say. So there had to be other evidence. Well, she was also born in October. And we know that anyone born in the same month as Halloween has got to be practicing the dark arts, right? But then there is this. And this was written this is from the poem Lenore by Edgar Allan Poe. So if you know Poe, you know all the weight that comes with him. He's the master of the macabre, right? But in addition to that, he was obsessed with his first wife who died, who fictionally he presented as Lenore. So if you think about The Raven, his most famous work, that's the Lenore he's talking about, right? When he's sitting there and he's thinking about Lenore when the raven comes in. But in this poem, this is just a small part of it. It says, "Ah, broken is the golden bowl, the spirit flown forever. Let the bell toll. A faintly soul floats on the Sturgeon River. Come, let the burial rites be read, the funeral song be sung, an anthem for the queenliest dead that died so young. A dirge for her, the doubly dead, in that she died so young." So, if you're a scholar of Edgar Allan Poe, and being an English teacher, I don't consider myself a scholar of Edgar Allan Poe, but you understand what he's saying here, right? You kind of get this idea. This, for example, an anthem for the queenliest dead that died so young, a dirge for her, the doubly dead, in that she died so young. You understand that the grief and the sadness is twice as much, not only because she died, but because she died so young. But that's not the way the people of Tallahassee took it. The people of Tallahassee took it as that she had risen from the dead. And who can rise from the dead other than witches, right? Also things like the spirit's flown forever. Broken is the golden bowl. They saw as some kind of, like you would say, like a vampire has to be staked through the heart. The only way to kill a witch was to, once again, like them, stake her and keep her into the ground by making sure that stake is planted in the ground after it goes through her heart. These are all misinterpretations, but they lead to this overwhelming idea, right? I mean, it's convincing evidence. She got an older man to fall in love with her, who then became obsessed and built this thing. She was born in October. Her grave faces the wrong way. She has to be killed twice. Edgar Allan Poe, anything related to him, what kind of man, rather than choosing a Bible verse that talks about love, chooses Edgar Allan Poe unless his wife is a witch? So this has become a haven for people who practice witchcraft. Some of the unusual activity that happens here, in addition to all of your typical cemetery stuff, right? So dark figures are seen, unexplained voices are heard, people hear growling in the cemetery all the time. Those are kind of the ones that are always there. If you want to get Elizabeth specifically to come see you, there are a few different ways you can do it. The first way is you have to, in the middle of the night, right? So this has changed. This used to be a midnight thing. Then it became, obviously, in modern times with our obsession with the witching hour and 3 o'clock. You go there at 3 o'clock with a single red rose, and you leave it in the middle, I'll show you, in this little cup that's right here. If you do that and then you back out of the square, it's said that Elizabeth will put her hand on your shoulder and she'll whisper in your ear. It's also said that you can go there with a flower and, if you're feeling that way, and a shot of alcohol, and you leave both of them on that little cup. And then when you step out, the same kind of thing. She'll put her hand on your shoulder and she'll whisper in your ear. Now, I'm not sure if we have any Edgar Allan Poe fans that are in the audience tonight, but if you know anything about Edgar Allan Poe, you know that his grave is said to be visited by a phantom who comes and leaves a single flower and a bottle of alcohol at his grave on his birthday. And people for years have been trying to catch this person. So I'm not sure if the Poe thing has kind of placed itself on there. I do know that I've done this during the day, and after stepping outside of that little place, I definitely felt as if Tallahassee completely dropped away. It was almost as if I was in like a pocket of absolute quiet. But there's other things that people do to try to get Elizabeth to speak. We were talking about the voodoo priestess in New Orleans earlier. Very similar things happen here. This is one of those places where people come from all around the state to practice witchcraft. And every indication of all the literature about Bessie says that if she was a witch, she was a good witch, right? She was what they call a white witch as opposed to a black or a dark witch. Therefore, real good witches, in reality, people who practice witchcraft and consider it themselves much more as a positive practitioner, come, and unfortunately they end up vandalizing a lot of Bessie, but they leave coins. They practice ceremonies actually physically inside this little area. They burn candles. You can actually see, for example, here on the left, this stain itself is actually not like mold like the rest of these, but this is wax. So people constantly have to come and like scrape the wax off of the stones that are here. And it's said that if you perform your ritual in front of Bessie, that she will be behind you, and the way they phrase it is she'll be blowing wind into your spell. One of the other things that's interesting here, and I think this is connected to the coins. I've been trying to track down one of the things I've found in other people's pictures is that people leave a quarter and a dime. So if we have anyone who practices any kind of ritual magic with us tonight, I consulted a few people that I trust ahead of time. I can't find out the significance of the quarter and the dime, but they leave 35 cents, a quarter and a dime, and that specifically. And this kind of connects to another one of the legends, which is if there is someone that you think has died and their ghost is thought to come back, you think you're being haunted by someone you know who has passed away, and you have to have known them, or someone who you were in conflict, or especially, this is kind of how it got started, another witch has died, to make sure that they're dead, right? Because their physical body is dead, but they're living that second life, right? They're leading that doubly dead aspect of things. You go to Bessie and you make an offering to Bessie, and she will guarantee, she's kind of like a Ghostbuster from beyond the grave. She will fulfill what you're doing, and she will force them to die their second death so that they will no longer bother you. And the popularity of this cemetery is in direct contrast to a little cemetery in a forgotten town called Pemberton Ferry, and this is Wild Cow Prairie Cemetery. I like to call this story something about those Vespers. I don't know if there's anyone outside of this community. I don't know if there's anyone outside of my friend's family who refers to ghosts as Vespers. And she's not even sure how her family began to call it that. Her name's Della Daughtry. She is actually responsible for saving this cemetery. This exists not too far from you guys. Think Brooksville, think Bushnell. Those different portions of those communities used to be called, especially Bushnell, someplace called Pemberton Ferry that we've talked about before in my presentations. It's a all but forgotten cemetery in a town that is almost 100% forgotten. But Della used to go there as a little child. And her grandmother used to see ghost lights. So if you can see in this back fence right here, that leads to the woods there, and then a prairie, I should say, a little bit of trees and then a prairie where there actually were wild cows up until the area was kind of tamed. The town of Pemberton Ferry kind of disappears from records in 1934 when it's bought by the Resettlement Administration. So the government comes in, buys it, basically sucks all the natural resources out of the place, and then kind of leaves it. And Wild Cow falls into disrepair, but it also disappears from records, right? A few years later, the Sumter County Hall of Records, their archives burn, and a lot of the records get destroyed there. Della has worked to not only research and give all of these people their kind of just due and take care of the cemetery, but also in 2020, in the process of saving this cemetery, which was scheduled to be completely paved over for a gas station. In 2020, they found 44 graves that didn't have headstones, some of which are outside of this fence. So it's definitely and there are a ton of cemeteries like this all throughout Central Florida that really are kind of in need of this kind of attention and saving oftentimes. I've been there. It's an absolutely one of the most peaceful cemeteries I've ever been in. I have never seen any of the Vespers that she's talked about. There are Confederate graves there. There are people who fought in the Seminole Wars, people who fought in World War I, World War II. It's an absolutely beautiful location, but it does kind of have its own curse that's attached to it. And that is the curse of love. And what is scarier than love? It is said that if you bring your someone special to Wild Cow Prairie Cemetery, that you will not only will you love each other and get married, but you will actually never get divorced. Now, this sounds absolutely silly, but the research has shown that people who they don't have to meet, obviously you don't meet someone in a cemetery, right? People who visit Wild Cow Prairie Cemetery during the dating stage in their lives actually fall in love, get married, and stay together. And I even have examples of people who were divorced from other people and then they ended up falling in love, or people who went with a friend of theirs who is of the opposite sex, and after going mysteriously, they fall in love with each other and they get married. This is not a stock picture like I Googled love or engagement. This is actually Della's daughter. And Della's daughter is a third or fourth generation person who fell in love and married the person who they went to Wild Cow Prairie Cemetery. So there's not really a ritual that you can raise ghosts with or you can communicate with ghosts with, but it does involve getting married, and what's scarier than that? So I thought I would include it. I'm not sure how many of you in that area who are watching tonight have been to Casadega and have heard about the Devil's Chair. This is one of the more interesting stories that it was actually one of the very first legend trips I wanted to take, and I didn't do it until March 17th of this year. This is the story of the Devil's Chair. So if you know Cassadaga is known as the psychic capital of the world. One of my favorite quotes having to do with Cassadaga says that it's Mayberry meets the Twilight Zone. It is a town that was founded and functions as a living, breathing, psychic example to the rest of the world. So people travel there to learn how to be a better psychic. People travel there to get the best readings of their lives. I have heard nothing but good things about the psychic readings that people have gotten there. It was originally founded in 1894 by George Colby, who was a trans medium himself, who got a psychic message. He's kind of the psychic version of John Smith, to go to this specific place, to go to Florida. And then when he got to Cassadaga, he was told to stop. And so this entire community, this entire town, it's not huge, has kind of developed around his ideas. And it's a great place if you're into the paranormal or into even just your psychic side. It's a great place to get a reading, but it's also great places to get books on psychics. We went to the Haunted History Museum, and it's absolutely fun in there. There's a whole history of all these different paranormal things. I was able to look at the Time Life books on the paranormal, which I hadn't seen since the early 80s when I first read them. The other thing that they have there, which was the reason we went, was in this horseshoe park, they have what is known as a fairy garden. And it is said that you can go into this fairy garden and capture fairies. So people have photographed these unexplained little creatures in there. People have gone, and we went there if you noticed the date, we went there on St. Patrick's Day to see if we could catch any leprechauns. I'm not quite sure, but I will say that since I brought the jars home, some really freaky stuff started happening in the house, not in terms of paranormal things, but my luck took these really, really dramatic changes. And I actually had to not only sage my entire house, but I went out with the jars and I let them out and I left them outside for the night, and things calmed down almost immediately afterwards. So it's a really cool place. If there are no fairies in there, if there are no real fairies in there, at the very least, it's a beautiful place where people have put up these fairy memorials, and they've put up these memorials to friends that they've loved, and it's a really great place to go. But then you get to Lake Helen Cemetery. You'll notice once again the coins that are left here. This area is known as the Devil's Chair. Now there's two places that are right near each other that have this same kind of setup. If you believe just the plain story, the Thatchers died there. I believe it was the husband wanted to continue to go to the graves, but he was kind of getting sick and elderly. So he had them build the wall and the chair so that he could sit in the chair and talk to his loved ones without being interrupted, without getting tired or anything like that. Other people say specifically that this chair was used to harness the devil. One of the legends that's attached to this location, one of the rituals, is that if you take a bottle of beer and you leave it on the devil's chair, when you come back in the morning, the beer will be empty. Okay, so maybe someone comes in the cemetery and drinks the beer. It could be a bottle of beer. It could be a can of beer. It'll be empty. Except for the fact the can won't be open. So people do this ritual enough that they actually patrol this area pretty well at night. And they say that you can't get in there anymore to do it. But people have recorded time and time again going into the cemetery and leaving a full bottle of beer or a full can of beer, and when they came back in the morning, it was empty. We tried the experiment with ginger ale, but it wasn't quite the same thing. But the other part of the story is if you sit in that chair and you ask for something you wish for, the devil will start to whisper in your left ear, telling you the terms of the deal. And if you agree, and then you leave an offering of coins, you've essentially sold your soul to the devil during that exchange. Now, let's say hypothetically, you're not sure what you want. You can just sit in the chair and the devil will start to talk to you once again in your left ear and tell you and kind of seduce you. Not only ask you, not just what do you want, but he'll start to tell you what he can give you. And it's the same kind of thing. If you leave money on the wall before you go, you've officially sold your soul to the devil. I'm not sure I would want to do either of those things. That is my son. I'm not sure if he sold his soul to the devil when he went there or what he might have sold his soul for. But I do know I didn't allow him to leave any kind of coins. It's interesting. The day we went there, there were no less than 3 other groups of people who were observing the devil's chair and trying to see if they could strike a deal with the devil. One person had traveled up, I think, from Miami, and it was her birthday, right? She wanted to do it because it was her birthday. And another was just a local paranormal group who were seeing if they could get weird readings. And then another was a film crew. So this is definitely, if you search for the Legends of Florida, this is one of the most popular. My last story tonight is going to be what I like to call the Humpty Dumpty haunting. And it's the same kind of thing. It's in stark contrast with the Devil's Chair. If Lake Helen Cemetery is one of the most popular places for people to go, Coon Hill Cemetery has got to be one of the most obscure, especially now. It is deep, deep, deep into the woods, and you can't drive there. Because of activity that I'm going to talk about, people have actually put up an additional fence further down so that you can't even get your car near it. You have to be a motivated person to go into this cemetery. And the people who do are motivated by the challenge. Now, the challenge is simple. All you need to do is walk around the entire length of this wall. So you can kind of see the picture here. I have tried to get the exact measurements of this. You hop up on the wall, which as you can see is about 3 feet high. It's about 1 foot in width. And you have to walk the entire length of the wall. And they say that no one can do it, right? When you start to walk on the wall, the first thing that you feel is someone tugging at your feet. And then all of a sudden, at some point, you will feel unseen hands. You'll hear a laugh, and then unseen hands will push you from the wall. I've seen videos of people doing it. It's one of those things where it's hit or miss. This gate that you see right here, this is new. They had to put this gate in the last 10 years because, unfortunately, this is a spot where that has attracted a lot of attention. So the Coon Hill Cemetery is in what is now known as I'm horrible with pronouncing these names, New Chuckamuckla, Florida, which is in Santa Rosa County. So it's in the Panhandle. It's pretty much on the border of Alabama, Arkansas, like those kind of places. It was built in Diamond Creek, right? So in 1820, on Diamond Creek, they started to build this town, and there were 2 possible names for it. One name was Possum Hill, and the other one is Coon Hill. And by an overwhelming vote, they decided to call it Coon Hill. And it's the typical story that you've seen time and time again in Florida. It was a little bit of a boom town. In 1900, they moved the post office from where it was in Coon Hill. The whole town was known as Coon Hill. From Coon Hill to Chuckamuckla. And as soon as they did that, the town died. Right? It was already kind of going downhill, but the town completely failed to the point where everyone literally lifted their houses. They took up the wood that they had used to build their houses and moved away. Right? So it's this forgotten town. And the only thing that exists, the only thing that remains are records and this cemetery. Now, the interesting thing is They started building this wall a few years before the town kind of officially went under. It is built from concrete, gravel, and sand, and it is in the middle of the woods. Now, if you know burial rituals in Florida, this is kind of unusual, especially for the turn of the century. Why were they building this wall? Right? Some people say it's to keep animals out. Well, you're not keeping any animals out. Some people say it has to do with the recent vandalism. So if you look on the right side here, this is one of the most vandalized cemeteries in all of Florida. And it's almost to the point of it being unexplainable. Now, some people have said that it has to do with the name, right? And there are actually that, coon is obviously a somewhat antiquated racial slur, but one that would have been in high use. That's not why it was named that. It was named that for raccoons. They've tried to have petitions to change the name to Possum Hill. All these different things. It still remains Coon Hill, and people feel that it might be the target of things because it's a symbol of racism. It also has a significant amount of Confederate graves, but that also is not something that's unusual in Florida cemeteries. Instead, people kind of go back to the idea that there is something dark in Coon Hill. So the idea might be that it was protecting, right? Like they built the wall to protect the people that were inside, to protect that area, that the hands that are pushing you off the wall are pushing you off the wall to protect what's inside. Anyone who goes into this cemetery says that it is one of the darkest places they've ever been, that the mood, as soon as you pass through that gate or jump over the wall, because usually the gate is closed, if you jump over the wall, you feel almost immediately like your breath is taken away. The temperature seems to drop dramatically. People have said they have heard crying or screaming or audible "get out." These kind of things you always associate with typically dark places. And it's interesting to note that whenever people get pushed, whenever they fall off, right? So even the people who I've seen, they're joking around, you see them, people lean, they always lean out of the cemetery. They never lean into the cemetery. People who walk the wall, who fall, never fall into the cemetery. They always fall outside of the cemetery. And so whether you're a believer in gravity or you're a believer in dark forces, there's definitely something that does not want you among those headstones. So that's my presentation for today. I'm hoping that you enjoyed it. I'm hoping that you guys, for my Central Florida, my beloved Central Florida people, I hope that you run out and get Haunted Florida Love Stories. A few of these, one or two of these are in that book, but it's a ton of other stories. I think there's about 20 of them in there. And I always give you guys this special deal. If you message me, if you like either Tripping on Legends or you like Haunted Florida Love Stories on Facebook, either of those on Facebook, then I will offer you the book, a signed copy of the book, for only $15. So the best way to get in touch with me is on Facebook, facebook.com/trippingonlegends. And like I said, if you like that page and then send me a message, I will process your order. Or you can go to facebook.com/Haunted Florida Love Stories and do the same thing. My website, which is not fixed on this, is www.trippingonlegends.com. And you can get in touch with me on Instagram and Twitter. Instagram is Spooky Tripping, and the Twitter is @SpookyBalzano. Does anybody have any questions? Boop. I'm gonna keep this screen up, but you don't want to hit the stop share, and that'll be awesome. I can't hear you at all, just so you know.
There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, I have. I shared his Facebook and his website in the chat window, so check the comments. Click on those links, and if you would like a copy of his book, please reach out. It's really great. There's a lot of really awesome stories and tales, just from not even if you're not like into purely ghost stories, just like the Florida history that's involved with all of these is really cool. And hearing about these local legends from someone who goes there and researches them is quite fantastic. So definitely check that out.
Definitely, that book is a lot more about haunted legends and the history behind a lot of these locations and history of these stories. I'm a teacher by trade, and so I always say, like, you can get people interested in a ghost story, then all of a sudden you can sneak in a little history or a little bit of how to tell a story. So Absolutely. It's definitely both a history book and an actual ghost book too.
Yeah, and it is really good. So definitely go to that Facebook, give it a like, and message Christopher on there. But if we didn't have any other questions in the chat, I didn't see any. But yeah, thank you again, Christopher. It was a great presentation as always. And yeah, we're excited to see you back. Hopefully, sometime in person very soon. That'd be really
excellent, great. Excellent. I'm hoping you as well. Thank you very much for having me on. Thank you for the Orange County Library System, and I really enjoyed talking to you and your patrons. So have as I always say on the show, may all your trips be legendary.
Oh, what a great way to end. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, have a good one. Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming out.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to find out when we have new fun and informative videos for you. Orange County Library System is your place to learn, grow, connect.